In the 90s, gaming hardware had significant limitations. 3D processing in games was still relatively new, and only so much could be done with the hardware of the time. Disks could only hold so much data, and when rendering a game in real time, computers could only handle so many calculations at once, and thus, the amount of objects that could be displayed on the screen was limited. Under these constraints, it would take some pretty unique developers to create worlds that approach our own reality, at least in terms of detail. Rand and Robin Miller were unique game developers. They got their start in the industry making children's educational games for the PC. Using Apple's HyperCard software, they could construct virtual worlds out of a slide deck presentation. Under the hood, their games were just a series of static images, rudimentary linked together, but that's not how they came across to the player. Players clicked where they wanted to go, and would instantly teleport to their desired location. For modern players, used to a smooth, real-time movement, this might seem awkward and unrealistic, but the strangeness quickly falls away, and the world envelops the player. Even though that animation doesn't play out on the screen, the journey was still implied. The trip from one location to the next played out in the player's mind, the only place that really matters. After years of making educational games, the Miller brothers felt an urge to make something aimed at adults. The results of that desire would come out in 1993 with the release of Myst. Using the same HyperCard program, the Millers transitioned away from the black and white drawings of their educational games into a fully colored 3D rendered environment. Unlike other games, which had to render their 3D worlds in real time, keeping track of each object's location on screen and performing all necessary calculations in a fraction of a second, the Millers could pre-render scenes and simply display them as images. Almost all of the processing was performed when the Millers rendered their scenes on their computers, giving the player's computer a comparatively lighter task of simply displaying the static images and managing clicks. The utility of their approach can be seen by comparing Myst to Doom, which released a few months after it. Doom is still a good-looking game, but its world is constructed out of repeating textures, blocky chunk walls, and its denizens are all flat images. Doom and other 3D real-time games had 3D worlds where fine details were implied. Myst was able to fill in texture other games could only hint at. Its virtual worlds were more lushly detailed than most anything that had come before, and it did more than just look good. On the island of Myst, players were treated to intricately crafted puzzles and a surreal story about using books to hop between worlds to free people trapped within the pages of their book prisons. The impact of Myst cannot be overstated. Upon its release in 1993, it quickly became the best-selling PC game of all time, and it wouldn't lose that spot until the release of The Sims. Outside of being a commercial success, Myst was a massive influence on puzzle game design. Many other developers tried to capitalize on Myst's popularity with their own Myst clones, and even today, the island of Myst and its sequels remain a touchstone for game developers. Part of what made Myst so successful was that its serene puzzle solving amongst beautiful worlds appealed to people who typically didn't play many games. People like Kyle Choi. Kyle Choi was a Hong Kong resident who wasn't particularly fond of video games. Blood and gore weren't appealing to Choi. Even games without violent presentations failed to impress him because he found their poor and unrealistic graphics confusing. Looking at games from the 80s and early 90s, it's not hard to see where Choi is coming from. Even the most technically advanced games were far from capturing anything close to a vista that one could find in the real world. One day, Kyle Choi decided to give these computer games another shot, bringing him into fateful contact with Myst. Every game that had come before had failed to compel Choi, but Myst was different. As Choi said, Myst is so far the only interactive adventure that I have played from beginning to end. Then I tracked down the whole game world trying to find another Myst, and failed, like most of you ever did. Seemingly, Myst had proven the merit of computer gaming to Choi, but alongside the joy of finding what he felt was the greatest game of all time, Choi was disappointed that little else could compare. When he wrote these words, there was no other game that Choi even found worthy of completion, let alone being compared to Myst in quality. Choi's failure to find another game he enjoyed as much as Myst planted a seed within him. If nobody else had made a game to rival Myst, Choi would have to make it himself. Choi had quite a multidisciplinary background. As a boy, he painted and played the piano. In college, he began an architectural degree, but eventually switched to computer science. With all of these fields under his belt, how daunting could game design be? Choi worked on his game full-time. He didn't feel it could be made any other way. Presumably, this full-time development process required him to step back from whatever job he was working before. After 3 years of development, the game was finally finished. It was called Comer. I worked full-time for the Comer development, and believe that a quality title does require the effort. There aren't many sources about Kyle Choi or Comer's development. The game's manual speaks a little about Choi and his history. Choi gave one interview to a review site called Just Adventure. If other interviews exist, they weren't archived, or nobody has been able to find them. A little more information can be gleaned from Choi's website, but those few sources represent all of the primary sources anybody has to draw on. Consequently, it's difficult to make many conclusive statements about Kyle Choi. In Comer's manual, Choi does describe a scene where some office workers are bored of their job and start discussing the meaning of life. A conversation which inspired Comer enough to be mentioned in the manual. What this office job was, it's impossible to say. All we can say is that after that point, Comer became a full-time commitment. Even at the best of times, game development is a daunting job. It requires a lot of care and attention, and financially, it can be a risky move. In the 90s, gaming was far less global. For a solo developer working in Hong Kong with no ties to anyone else in the gaming industry, finding a publisher or an audience would be incredibly difficult. Comer was by no means a guaranteed success. Working full-time on a solo game project is risky, especially for a developer with no ties to the broader gaming industry. If Comer were to fail, it would no doubt be a financial setback. However, that didn't deter Choi. At the very least, his commitment to his game shows serious dedication. If there was ever a man who believed in his artistic vision, it was Kyle Choi. Comer is a game about creation and humanity's place in history. It supposes that Earth's biological history is separated into distinct periods, where certain creatures reign supreme, such as the age of dinosaurs or the age of humanity. Comer also suggests that each era comes to an end with a bang that eliminates most life. In Comer, the age of the dinosaurs came to an explosive end, and humanity is faced with the possibility of another bang. Shortly after finding an archaeological site that suggests a period of coexistence between humans and dinosaurs, another site is discovered, a cradle of higher beings. Various people are sent to stop this cradle experiment before its completion, because if it isn't stopped, humanity will be destroyed. Those sent to this cradle are called Comers, and they include figures like Einstein, Da Vinci, Sinbad the Sailor, and you, the 28th Comer.
Congratulations for having been chosen as the 28th of all the comers to this land. This is not just a physical journey, but the one of imagination and of mind. So explore, be challenged, and enjoy.
Cummer's premise is definitely a bit strange. In the real world, roughly 65 million years separate humans and dinosaurs, and it wasn't our arrival that brought them to an end, but rather natural disasters, a meteor, and changing climates. However, realistic or not, this is the premise that begins Cummer. Cummer proudly wears its Myst influence from the very start. The game's first puzzle traps the player on top of a towering spire. Behind the player is the phrase, Myst Art. In order to proceed, the letters must be slid around to say, My Start. It's a cheeky nod to the game's inspiration, but it radiates earnesty. Cummer wants you to know that Myst is art, and that Choi will carry forward Myst's baton of creativity into a brighter future. However, shortly after the Myst art puzzle, one of my biggest problems with Cummer rears its head. Early in the game, Cummer does a poor job at guiding the player's attention towards pivotal aspects of the world. Cummer's opening platform might in fact be the clearest example of obfuscation in the entire game. Aside from the Myst art puzzle, there isn't much on the starting platform. The player can look out and see a house below, but the path to that house is by no means obvious. There are no stairs, nor any other obvious path down. All that exists is a phone, which is actually the first thing you see when you start the game. This identifies the phone as something really important. Elsewhere on the platform, there are no buttons, no levers, seemingly nothing else that can be interacted with besides this phone, so it's quite natural for the player to be drawn to it as a means of getting to the house. There are even a bunch of numbers on the receiver, a cryptic detail that stands out as a potential clue. Typing this number into the phone plays an indecipherable reversed message, another clue that the player is on the right track. After I received this message, I spent several minutes messing with this phone, trying to figure out what I was supposed to do. Maybe I was supposed to enter the numbers backwards to reverse the garbled message, but this produced nothing, nor did any set of numbers I tried. The phone is eventually important as a method of receiving expository dialogue, but it has absolutely nothing to do with your descent from the platform. In the absence of any other obvious ways of going down, the phone is a massive red herring that distracts players from the actual path forward. In reality, the tower has an elevator, and by standing in the right spot and clicking the bottom of the screen, the player will go down, so long as the My Start puzzle has been solved. Part of what makes this opening so frustrating is that the signifier that informs the player that they can go down is incredibly easy to miss. When mousing over the bottom of the screen, the arrow changes to point down, but this simply is not adequate. If the player never moves their mouse to the lower part of the screen, as they seemingly would have little reason to do, they will miss this signal entirely. Even if the player does mouse over the bottom of the screen, it's entirely possible that this detail could be unnoticed or overlooked. It isn't helped by the fact that the areas that move the player left or right have priority over the area which moves the player down. If the player clicks in either of the bottom corners, they will go left or right, eating into the screen space allotted for downward movement. Considering that the importance of moving down in this instance far outweighs the importance of moving left or right, it would have been better if moving down had taken priority over horizontal movement. Additionally, the screen that moves the player down is not the most obvious screen that could have been used. If the player is standing in the seemingly right spot, facing towards the phone in the middle of the platform, Clicking the bottom of the screen only walks the player towards the phone. It is only when the player is on this specific screen, where the camera is pointed down towards the house, that going down is possible. What makes this particular instance of poor direction disappointing is that there's a relatively simple solution. In Myst, whenever there's an elevator, it's given very obvious controls. Big buttons that are hard to miss, that clearly identify how to operate the elevator. If Comer had a button, I doubt it would have taken me so long to get off the starting platform. When I finally did, I didn't feel clever, nor did I feel as if I had cracked some rewarding code. Primarily, I was annoyed that I had wasted so much time trying to solve a puzzle, when, in reality, the game had merely poorly telegraphed that its puzzle had already been solved. Fortunately, after this point, Comer's strengths are better highlighted. Comer is a gorgeous package, with special attention paid to its visuals and auditory design. Much of the appeal of Myst-style games lies in their world design. Myst was particularly notable because, in comparison to its contemporaries, it offered an immersive world that felt real. Comer delivered a world that I wanted to explore purely to see what would come next. The world of Comer elicits a wide range of feelings, from the cozy solar house, the mysterious complex among a dew-wet forest, or the magnificent pyramid that's the stage for the game's final act. That pyramid is large and spacious, which adds simultaneously to the site's grandeur, but also its coldness. Where the other buildings in the game exist on scales more comforting to human proportions, the final pyramid dwarfs the player, instilling feelings of insignificance. Choi absolutely has a propensity for architecture that becomes apparent in how his virtual buildings so thoroughly convey aesthetic qualities beyond looking good. Comer's themes about harmony with nature and humanity's place in the universe are echoed in the design of the buildings that the player explores. Choi was heavily inspired by the works of Frank Lloyd Wright, which most obviously shines through in Comer's Solar House, which bears a striking resemblance to Wright's West Talesian complex. However, the influence goes far beyond this one building. Choi was inspired by Wright's ability to blend his buildings with the natural world, creating a structure in harmony with nature instead of fighting against it. My favorite example of this in Comer comes in this mossy forest, where these pavilions surround humongous green trees. It's a great example of how the artificial and natural world can come together to make both more beautiful. Thinking about how such a grand structure could be built around a still-living tree, it implies an architect that is forward-thinking and creative in their attempt to elevate architecture. It's a great example of how the artificial and the natural can come together to make both more beautiful. The music of Comer also needs to be acknowledged for its role in establishing Comer's ethereality. Comer's music draws on classical arrangements to craft haunting melodies. Overall, it's soft music that was made to accompany Comer's lonely world, and at a few points got me to stop and take a few moments to simply soak the scene up through my eyes and ears. In a medium where action is so core to the experience, moments where a player chooses to stop interacting for the purposes of absorbing the beauty of the world are special. Without the music, I might have progressed through the game faster, but I would have missed something in doing so. When designing Comer's puzzles, Choi was aiming for an experience that wasn't insanely difficult. However, he still wanted to leave players with a satisfying moment of apotheosis. In Comer's manual, Choi says, You will find the puzzles very simple and meaningful when you solve them. An instinct in your mind will probably make you shout. For the most part, Choi succeeds in designing simple puzzles that are nonetheless satisfying to unravel, with some notable exceptions. For example, in the Green Pavilion, there's a puzzle that involves turning a bow and arrow into a peace branch. This puzzle was extremely difficult for me, not because the solution was actually hard, but because I didn't realize that the tip of the bow could be clicked to rotate it into the proper shape. Again, this is the fault of poor signification. When hovering over the part of the bow that must be clicked to solve the puzzle, the cursor doesn't change, meaning that there's no indication to the player that clicking the tiny end of the bow will produce results any different from clicking elsewhere on the bow. It's another example of Comer's tendency to misdirect through an inability to telegraph what actions are possible. In the second area, there is this puzzle involving the adjustment of knobs to achieve the correct water level. There is a logic in solving this puzzle which involves noticing how this pole splits this crescent into 1/3 and 2/3 segments, which just so happens to be the proper ratio needed to get the water to the correct height. When solving this puzzle, I accidentally stumbled into the solution, without even finding the clue that tells you what to do. When finding something unknown in a puzzle game, I often take a few moments to interact with it, just to see what all it can do and what information I need to keep an eye out for. This experimentation isn't actually meant to solve the puzzle, it's only supposed to poke and prod at the logic to get an indication of how this device works. However, when I was doing my initial fiddling with this water fountain, I just came across the solution without even trying to. I had solved this puzzle, but I had no idea what the logic was behind it, and thus I didn't really have that satisfying aha moment that the best puzzle games are built on. There was no connection in my head between the crescent and the fountain. While I do think that this puzzle was a bit flawed in how it's too easy to find the correct solution by just guessing, it could have been way worse. I would rather have a puzzle like this, where I can accidentally stumble into the answer without the satisfaction of understanding why my solution worked, than one where I'm stuck in the sky for over 15 minutes with nothing to interact with, because I failed to notice the down cursor. Despite my complaints about a few of Comer's puzzles, they're generally quite good. Choi's strength lies in his creativity in puzzle design. The best of his puzzles require the player to make realizations about the world and its construction, and to act on the information in specific ways. Highlights for me include puzzles like this one, which involves drawing a connection between these bizarre symbols and the items stored in Da Vinci's desk, to fill in a 2x3 grid. Another great puzzle is this one, which requires players to match the point of view of these framed images, and then to use that information to correctly associate the perspectives with their associated locations on a map. These aren't the hardest puzzles, but they're rewarding to solve because they end with a moment of understanding, where the pieces fall into place in a moment of eureka. A moment where your mind will probably make you shout. When the game properly conveys its information, Comer's puzzles are unique, inventive, and fun. Comer's most complicated, nuanced, and deep puzzle lies not in its moment-to-moment gameplay, but in the moments where the player asks themselves, what is this all supposed to mean? Choi didn't want his story to be mere motivation to get the player from point A to B. Instead, he desired something that went above and beyond to get the player to contemplate the world on a deeper level, and to walk away having learned something important. Comer's story is one about creation, God, annihilation, and the seemingly perpetual cycle of life on our planet, always changing in the composition of its creatures, but never ceasing. What happens when humanity finds itself on their creator's chopping block? just as the dinosaurs before. It's certainly a topic to match Choi's ambition. To find Cummer's story, simply look around. Throughout the lonely world of Cummer, there are a lot of details that aren't relevant for progression, but still serve a purpose in expanding Cummer's world, and in communicating the nuances of its story. In the Solar House, the player can find a series of drawings that wordlessly establish the myth of Cummer. They depict a once peaceful town, beset by a terrible beast that lives in the mountains. It can't be sated, even after a woman is presented as a sacrifice. Eventually, the beast is defeated by a strange being with light for a head, who saves the woman, though their return to the village is not welcomed. Because of this rejection, the pair return to the mountain, and once again the village is at peace. I really like these murals as an introduction to Cummer's story because they prompt so many questions relevant for the story to come. How literal are these murals? Who made them? What is the beast in the mountain? Is it a monster, or merely a representation of destructive volcanic forces? Why are those murals here, in this modern house? What are the consequences of the village's rejection? The ambiguity of the environmental storytelling keeps the narrative from feeling heavy-handed and invites the player into a state of mindfulness and contemplation to ponder their own meaning, especially as these murals get recontextualized by the writings that come later.
Now back to the story, or should I use a better term, the experiment. The romantic presentation reveals 3 characters, which I would give them names from a modern point of view. First, the dragon on top of the volcano, that's the dinosaur. Second, the villagers, human. And the third, the one with the face of light. What is that? Dinosaur never spits fire. This is nothing more than a volcanic eruption. Or you can interpret as, the dinosaur became ruthless and jeopardized the experiment of a newer species, human. So, dinosaur was decided to be exterminated, giving way to human.
Across the game's second and third areas, the player encounters the writings of several historical figures. Leonardo da Vinci, Albert Einstein, Sinbad the Sailor. These were just a few of the previous comers who failed to stop the experiment to end humanity. Einstein wonders about the dinosaurs, ultimately postulating that they were destroyed because they were a threat to the human experiment.
This is the 27th comer again. Let me continue my interpretation of the findings, which may position us a step closer to the realm of light. The evil side of human nature could be more destructive than volcanic eruption, and probably is the reason why the second experiment is going to an end. Another plan was drafted. The volcano was calmed. The place was chosen. The new experiment is underway. Now I understand why dinosaur was never mentioned in all the holy works. We human face the same destiny of replacement. Here I saw the new being and heard their groaning. They are in the form of light, of pure energy state, no flesh. Did Sinbad warn us with his story? Did Vinci give us hint in his art? Did we already know many from our religions and prophecy? But our hope lies. I am doing my best to intervene in the process and to persuade the new being to go away. The fact I learned is that they rest in trees. For those trees on the island and around the shore, they are everywhere.
As humanity has shown its violence, lack of concern for those in poverty, and its rampant destruction of nature, perhaps humanity has threatened nature for too long. I had mentioned that Cummer was a game about saving humanity, and that's certainly true, but Cummer wants you to ask what our salvation looks like. At the end of the game, when you convince the beings of light to leave and conclude the experiment, they take their trees with them. Saving humanity is not met with a triumphant celebration. It's met with a silent, desolate island. Perhaps things did not have to be this way. After all, shutting down the experiment of new life wasn't our only choice. Maybe we could have set aside our petty squabbles, our violence, our overconsumption, and created a harmonious world. A world that wouldn't necessitate our destruction to pave way for something new. When humanity was faced with a species-ending catastrophe brought about by our violence and hatred, we didn't choose to become more caring to avoid our annihilation. We chose to sidestep self-improvement and kick the light beings off our planet. To me, this is the ultimate meaning of Cummer, the solution to the game's true puzzle. Cummer is a warning. As our environment crumbles around us and our greed festers, we shouldn't be like the humanity of Cummer, the one that solves its catastrophe in a way where it doesn't have to change. Instead, we should become more loving, more caring, and more generous. Perhaps it is there that humanity can find a salvation that doesn't leave itself hollow. Despite being a game that came out in 1998, Cummer's message still rings relevant for us today. Cummer is not a perfect game, but every part reflects care and passion from its creator. Its environments are plump with beauty, its music fittingly melancholic, and it's all in service of a thoughtful exploration of humanity and our place in the universe. The fact that one man with no industry ties created Cummer is astounding. This is not a game thrown together to make a quick buck. This is a game made with passion. There is no other game like Cummer, and there might never be a game like it again. Cummer is a game worth remembering. It's just a shame that so few people do. Towards the end of development, Kyle Choi tried to find a publisher for his enigmatic puzzle game. For whatever reason, Choi was unable to find one, which forced him to self-publish Cummer on his own personal website. With almost no marketing behind the game, no publisher, no contact with the rest of the gaming industry, and little interest from major review sites, Cummer's fate is unsurprising. Choi never publicly said how many copies of Cummer he sold, but I don't think he had to. We know it did not sell well. On Choi's website, where Cummer was sold, he would put short sayings towards the top. They're usually short quotes about philosophy or history, but there's one in particular that drew my attention. A man spent 3 years to learn how to kill a dragon. He finally got the skill, but found no dragon. To me, knowing the context of those lines, there's a certain tragedy there in a man training for years, but not finding the dragon that he had looked for. Choi elaborates more on the meaning of his statement in the Q&A section of his website, where he lists his response to the question, "How does Cummer sell?" Here is his reply. During Cummer development period, I really don't know if Myst-type games are still people's favorite, or if a publisher is willing to publish that type of games. Think of this analogy. A man spent 3 years to learn how to kill a dragon. He finally got the skill, but found no dragon. For that, I got a reply saying, "Why don't you learn the skills to kill lion, tiger, or even wolf. I wondered, well, they are all small animals. Would you like to play a quality game or loads of so-so ones? It's ultimately a little unclear what killing a dragon means for Choi. He's a man who, when asked about the sales of his magnum opus, chooses to speak in poetic riddles. Whether dragon killing is analogous to getting the attention of a publisher, attaining some level of financial success, or some other metric, Choi doesn't elaborate further. What I do know is that Choi was a man dedicated to creating the vision as he had intended it. A man who was uncontent merely slaying a dragon, tiger, or a wolf. If a man is skilled enough to slay a dragon, yet never finds one, what happens then? I ultimately can't say what Choi thought of Comer after its release, but I often put myself in his shoes, and am horrified at the thought of a man dedicating 3 years of his life to produce a magnum opus that hardly anyone played. He poured his talent, his money, and his time into a project he wholeheartedly believed in. Choi, the man who had once felt that games with their violence and nonsensical graphics weren't all that great, decided to produce the kind of game that he would be happy to play. In that regard, I think Choi succeeded. There's an immense maturity in an artist who speaks to what they want to see in the world, regardless of if that vision is popular. Despite making a game that met his own standards, Choi certainly didn't create a successor to Myst with regards to sales or popularity. Among the few adventure gaming sites that reviewed the game, Comer was received warmly. There was an audience of people who played and loved Comer, pocketed away in adventure game forums. Comer apparently generated enough buzz that 5 years after its release, it was reviewed on a French game review site. But the fact that the review opens by saying, "Comer, this name will surely mean nothing to you," should tell you all you need to know about the game's popularity. Beyond its small circle of adventure gamer fans, Comer was received with an utter ambivalence. Almost all traces of Comer have been wiped from the internet. The old review sites who originally covered the game suffered the same fate as much of the early internet. They moved to new servers, stopped paying for domains, took down their old pages, or otherwise have been buried in the algorithmic search engine optimization arms race. Each review that fell into obscurity was one less review that could potentially introduce the game to a new audience. Choi's website only lasted until 2004 before it was taken down, along with the only legal way one could obtain a copy of the game. Today, the former website of Choi's Shine Studio refers not to the ambitious game developer trying to sell his magnum opus, but rather the landing page of a Hollywood animation studio. As far as I know, Choi hasn't publicly made any online statements after his website went down. In some regard, I feel that Comer came out at exactly the worst time. By the time it released in 1998, there was a small cottage industry of games inspired by Myst. There were titles like The Journeyman Project, Lighthouse, The Dark Being, The Labyrinth of Time, Rama, The Pink Gear Collection, and many, many more. In 1997, the Miller brothers released Riven, Myst's sequel. Like Myst, it was also a massive critical and commercial success. Choi believed that an oversaturation of the first-person adventure genre contributed to Comer's poor sales. If Comer released too late to make much of an impact, it also released too early. Throughout the 2000s, independent developers gained more tools to get eyes on their games, and larger audiences began seeking the experiences larger development studios weren't offering. 2004 saw the release of Cave Story, a platformer developed in its entirety by a single person, that then went on to become immensely popular. And it's by no means the only independent project to achieve success. 2007 brought the release of Braid, and with it came further proof that smaller independent games could be successful commercial endeavors. As the internet has become more widely adopted, independent studios have found greater tools for marketing their game, which has allowed their games to reach larger audiences. Had Comer released in the new indie paradigm, it likely would still be obscure, but I imagine it would still find an audience hungry for the sort of experiences it offered. I stumbled onto Comer by pure happenstance. One day I was scrolling Twitter, as one does, and I just happened to come across an article titled The Long Silent Journey of Kyle Choi's Comer, written by games historian Phil Salvador. It's a great essay about the historical preservation of games centered around Comer, and it served as my introduction to the game. As I got to the meat of the article, Comer hooked itself firmly into my brain. I doubt it will ever fall out. Obscure games tend to stick to me like spilled soda left in the sun. I find great joy in talking about the obscure. There will always be people willing to comment on what is popular, and I'm glad that there are. Hearing the plethora of takes on the current cultural zeitgeist is interesting, and it's important to catalog the popular and influential games of our day. However, the experiences which fail to grab the attention of wider audiences aren't guaranteed spokespeople. Niche and obscure games are at risk of not having their stories told, nor their innovations, triumphs, and failures recognized, unless people make the conscious effort to talk about them. Discourse is how games persist in our cultural consciousness. Game reviews do more than simply provide potential consumers with an opportunity to evaluate if a game is worth their money. Historical articles do more than merely preserve a game's past. Game analyses do more than merely examine the mechanics and systems. All of these things put games onto people's radars, often inspiring players to experience these games for themselves. Each new voice talking about a game acts as a potential new entry point, another path for discovery. A game which fails to procure a spot at the discursive table risks fading away into obscurity, potentially denying future generations the opportunity to experience the passion and joy that was poured into that game. As Comer demonstrates, this isn't some hypothetical quandary. Fading into obscurity, mostly unrecognized, is something that actually happens to games, and I'm certain that Comer isn't the only victim. Before I set out on this project, there was only one video about Comer on YouTube. It had only 15 minutes of gameplay from a channel dedicated to cataloging every game with a first-person perspective. Its footage only shows a fraction of what's in the game. Had Phil Salvador never written his article about Comer, the game almost certainly would have passed me by. And this video is, in some way, an attempt to pass along the message. I think a lot about Kyle Choi, the man who spent 3 years learning to kill a dragon. On some level, his story haunts me because it's a perfect reminder of just how arbitrary and fickle remembrance is. It would have been so easy for Comer to pass me by. I only found it because someone I follow on Twitter happened to retweet the article and introduced me to the game. Had I not checked on social media that day, or even if I had just checked an hour earlier or later, I doubt I would have stumbled across this game again. The fact that I found Comer at all is mere coincidence. Personally, I'm really happy that I found Comer, but to truly understand Comer is to understand that it isn't the only obscure hidden gem. There are so many artists who are sharply proficient but have never been recognized. I mourn for all of the life-changing oddities that exist somewhere out there that will never cross my path because I didn't happen to check Twitter or YouTube at the right moment. Even if people learn about Cummer, actually playing the game is such an investment that most people will be driven away. Cummer was programmed to run on the Windows 95 and 98 operating systems, and at the time of writing, that falls in the awkward era of Windows history where it's not old enough to run on easy-to-set-up emulators like DOSBox, but it's also not new enough to be supported by modern operating systems. The only way to play Cummer is to either own an extremely rare physical copy and a computer that runs Windows 98, or to use a virtual machine. The first time I played Cummer, I used VMware, and the process of setting it up was immensely complex. In addition to the VMware software, I needed a Windows 98 installation disk, which also had to be downloaded. I also had to download Cummer itself, which had thankfully been uploaded to the Internet Archive by Phil Salvador. But the downloaded files had to be converted to ISOs, a process which required me to install yet another piece of specialized software. When that was done, I had to go through the process of installing an old-school operating system with BIOS and booting and lots of other complicated stuff. And this is before I even get to the part where I actually start installing Cummer. When I finally got the game working on VMware, I learned that Cummer had issues interfacing with certain sound cards, and thus all of the audio that plays during videos was absent. This was actually how I initially played Cummer, and it made the story much harder to follow, and this puzzle from the Mossy Pavilion became nigh unsolvable without a guide. In order to solve these issues, I had to switch to another virtual machine program called PCem, which was even more complex to install than VMware, and uses far more system resources. When playing on VMware, my clicks would instantly register, but on PCem, there was about a second of lag as it processed my click, but at least I had all of the sound. In addition to the performance hit, the PCem version also was a step down with regards to graphics. Every animation was choppier, and the colors just weren't quite as good. As games age and their original hardware becomes increasingly inaccessible, the effort required to play these games vastly increases. If we want old games to be talked about, and consequently to be remembered, we need to make them as easy to play as possible. Emulators and fan games are oftentimes lauded as bastions of preservation, and they definitely help more people access older games. But I also think it's important to consider emulation from an outsider's perspective. For people who aren't plugged deep into gaming discourse, which is most people, emulation is a daunting process, if they even know what emulation is at all. It requires a level of technical know-how and internet literacy that is unreasonable to expect of an average person just looking to unwind and play some games. I care a lot about gaming history, as do many people. However, I can't help but wonder how many more people would be willing to get into playing classic games if they were sold just like any other game on modern platforms. Cummer is a perfect example of why preservation matters. Back when it was sold online, more people were buying and talking about the game in a way that just hasn't been seen since the game became confined to the realms of virtual machine emulation. If a game isn't easy to play, it will be remembered by fewer people, and audiences who might enjoy the game will be cut off from that experience. Admittedly, I don't have much of a solution, at least not for Cummer. Without an ability to contact its creator, nobody has the rights to authorize a version of Cummer better suited for modern systems, and by the time it enters the public domain, who knows how much of a pain this game will be to get running. I guess, in the meantime, all I can really do is talk about the game and share it with whoever will listen. Cummer is a game that deserves to be remembered. It might not have had a massive impact, but the world is undoubtedly a better place because Cummer exists. If Cummer is ever forgotten entirely, we will have lost something quaintly beautiful, something a man sacrificed 3 years of his limited time on Earth to produce, something which no doubt had exceptional talent and passion behind its creation. If that isn't a tragedy, I don't know what is. I have no idea what Kyle Choi thought of Cummer's reception. Perhaps he was satisfied having made a game that he felt was worthy of Myst's legacy. Perhaps he was disappointed that his profound and heartfelt expression of beauty he found in the world was met with a resounding silence by most. Ultimately, we will never know. His thoughts are inaccessible to us. All that survives is his game, astonishing in the boldness of its vision and the belief in its worth. Choi was a man who could slay dragons if only he was given the chance. Hey, so thank you for making it to the end of the video. It's one of my longest videos, so it really means a lot that you have stuck around to the end. And in addition to thanking everyone else who watches and shares my videos, I wanted to thank a few other people. Firstly, I'd like to thank Phil Salvador for writing The Long Silent Journey of Kyle Choi's Cummer. It's the article that introduced me to the game, and it also goes into some very interesting stuff about games and game history in general. In particular, talking about how gaming on the fringes, the way we talk about that and categorize that history is complicated because it's not tied in with, the larger, more commercial games, so we have less resources to work with. And, the article gives a lot of very interesting food for thought. So if you like games history, check out that article. Also, check out Phil Salvador's blog, The Obscuritory. He talks about all kinds of obscure and very interesting games on his blog as well, so definitely check that out. I certainly enjoy reading about all the strange games he writes about on that blog. Additionally, I would like to thank KiteLine. He's a big Cummer fan. He owns a couple copies of the game, and he was the one who had scanned the manual for me to use at a couple of points in this video. And without his scanned version of the manual, I certainly would not have been able to, learn as much as I could about Cummer. So I wanted to especially thank KiteLine for providing the manual that I read. Additionally, I had a lot of help with this video. Several people that I know read through the script, gave me advice and feedback, and there's too many to name by name, but for everyone who read this video and gave feedback on it, thank you for that. And additionally, I would also like to thank my patrons, whose financial support is definitely helpful when making these huge projects. And in addition to all of the thanks, I also did want to provide a brief disclaimer. Firstly, this should be obvious, but I do not know Kyle Choi. And so, when writing this, this video was very tricky to write because I did not want to fall into the beginner's guide trap of, assuming I know anything about the author. I don't. I tried to, stick pretty much just to, what he said in, his, manual and interviews, which, definitely does not leave a lot of room for, super definitive statements. So, just keep that in mind, that, there's only a couple of sources about this game, so it's very tricky to write about, and writing about its history. And I also did want to mention that you can play Cummer. Phil Salvador uploaded the game to the Internet Archive, which is how I was able to play the game. And I will leave some sources in the description for, you know, some virtual machines, as well as like a link to the Internet Archive version of Comer. I do mention in the video that it is a pretty complicated process, and, you know, that's still true. But, you know, it's a very interesting game, and if what I said in this video piqued your interest, I definitely recommend going and checking it out. I also did want to mention that, you know, if the idea of installing a virtual machine to play Comer doesn't sound super appealing, I totally get that. And in that case, I have recorded a couple of playthroughs of Comer, one in VMware, one in PCem, and I'll link those in the description as well. You know, as I mentioned, the PCem version has all of the sound, so, you know, its story is easier to follow, even though the game, when I recorded it in VMware, just looked a lot nicer. So, you know, there's no real ideal version to watch, but I have both of those playthroughs on YouTube, so, you know, you can go check those out. Once again, thank you for getting to this point in the video, and have a good day.